Hello everyone, Ron again, and in this video we're going to talk about monocompatibility. So first of all, what is monocompatibility? It means that a stereo signal can be collapsed or summed to mono without significant loss that would make it indistinguishable. So to understand that, you should watch the previous video about phase correlation, and after that we have to understand what it means for a signal to be mono versus being stereo. So mono means that all the information in the left channel and the right channel is the same. So both speakers play all of that information at the same volume, and that is what makes it mono. We perceive mono to be in the center or panned in the middle rather than left or right at all. It's just directly in the center. Now, effects such as delay and reverb can cause the two channels to have information that is unique to each of them, and that's what it means to be stereo. That means the right and left channel have sounds that are each unique to them. So there are some sounds that play on the left channel that don't play in the right channel, and there are some that play in the right that don't play in the left. So when something is mono, the information is correlated because it's all the same. And when it's stereo, or when it has things that are unique in the left and right, respectively, that's uncorrelated. One thing that results is the sensation of a wide stereo field, potentially, but another is phase cancellation. So why is that? As we saw in the previous video, if the same signal is panned right and left, like you duplicate it and you pan one left and you pan one right, and you don't invert them, they just combine together and double in amplitude in the middle. So you have a right and left sound that combine together to be in the middle twice as loud. But if you invert them and they're the same volume, then when you recombine them, they phase cancel and no sound is produced. So when you think about that fact, if you had the same sound on the right and left, ordinarily, like in nature, you will hear that sound played twice through both ears, but it doesn't work that way digitally. So when you consider that it's going to combine back to being mono and sound like it's in the center, you recognize that you have to change the sound, right? Because if you had two exact copies of the same sound, then that would be 1 plus 1, and that equals 2, rather than 1 minus 1 equaling 0. But 2, in this case, means that it's the same thing as 1, but it's just louder. You would think of 2 naturally as having one thing and then one more thing, but when you think about it in digital audio, it's kind of like the first thing just gets bigger. So when you consider that, if the two sounds were the same, when you combine them, you know, like if you duplicate the sound and then you have 2 of it and they're exactly the same, that it would get louder. You recognize that if you want to make a sound wide and it's just one individual sound, you'd have to duplicate it and change its phase or some other attribute it has, right? Like pitch, maybe. But if you change the phase and you made exact copies and they play at the same time, there's going to be phase cancellation. Now, because you are trying to widen this one sound, it's obvious that it's going to play at the same time. So that's why stereo with plugins, you have to be careful with them, and they result in phase cancellation at times, right? So that's what causes a stereo sound to disappear in mono, right? The mono sound is correlated, the stereo sound is uncorrelated. Now, logically, because you can't have 2 of the same thing, the right side to play the same sound as the left without them adding together it's got to be a different phase. And so when you sum them back together and they're added together in mono, the difference in phase, if you're using the same sound duplicates, that's what causes the phase cancellation. And that's why when you switch some of the things that you may make to mono, they disappear. But if you remember the example in the previous video, if I turn down the amplitude of the negative signal, the one that had been inverted, some of the positive signal would still remain because the positive one was louder. So when you think about that, when you have a sound and more of it is correlated than uncorrelated, that's why it does not disappear completely in mono, but it just sounds really low. Because if you look back in the previous video, when I started to lower the amplitude of the negative copy of the sound, the inverted one that was in channel 2, channel 1 started to come back. So you can see that the wave was there, but it was smaller, so it would just be quieter. And that's phase cancellation. The same thing will happen on the entire stereo bus when it's summed to mono. So some of the sound will remain, but most of it will disappear. And now, because this is complicated, in my opinion, and sort of possibly hard to follow, I have an analogy for you. And in this analogy, you have a colony of ants, right? Now, there are 3 groups of ants in addition to the queen. And one of them represents the left channel, one represents the right, and one represents the center. So let's say hypothetically, 1/3 of the ants rebel, another third of the ants want to fight and defend the queen, and the final third can understand both sides, so they don't want to fight either side, right? In the example, the queen represents the original signal. So say you play a synth and you run the synth through reverb. The reverb is the part of it where if the synth is in mono, the reverb would probably cause phase cancellation. And so the whole reverb wouldn't last when it's summed to mono from stereo. But back to the analogy. So the queen represents the original signal, and every ant besides the queen represents a copy of the original signal. So if you think of a colony, you can think of reverb like that. Reverb is a very rapid, successive copying of a sound. Reverb is made up of really fast echoes that blend together, and we perceive them as being one sound that decays. So the queen is the original signal. The half of the ants that are rebelling represent the negative inversion of the sound. The ones that want to defend the queen represent the positive copies of that sound. And the neutral ones who don't fight, they represent the center channel. So the two that are fighting each other, that represent the left and right, are going to take each other out. All the ants, if they're even, they're going to simply kill each other one-on-one in this example. So the left and right cancel for that reason. The ones who don't fight remain in the center. And so those are the ants that are going to survive the battle alongside the queen, because obviously the queen is the original signal. So that third of the ants is the mono remnant that's going to be heard when the entire song is summed to mono and possibly played back through a large speaker in a club or on a cell phone, right? So they understand both sides, sort of like the center channel, or the mid channel rather, and they're correlated in that way. So that metaphor, I hope it helps you to understand, but that's the idea of like what happens, as I understand it, if you have stereo reverb, and I'm actually going to demonstrate that now. So if you remember from the last video, I explained and showed something called an oscilloscope, which provides a visual representation of a waveform and the shape of that wave. This is a vector scope, and it provides a visual representation of the stereo field. And if you have a telescope, those allow you to see the stars. So now what the vector scope does, the purpose of it is to show you how much of your information is correlated versus uncorrelated, and to give you an estimate of if your mix is going to disappear in mono. And in this case, this is the Ozone 9 Imager. There is the Ozone Imager 2, which is a free plugin, which looks like this, but I'm using this one because it has a mono button, and Imager 2 does not. So you got 3 different sections here: polar sample, polar level, and Lisa Joe. Now when you look at these two, you got the 45-degree angles, and you can see my voice in the middle, and that means it's in mono because it's completely in the middle. This +1 right here means the same thing. If my voice was totally uncorrelated, it would be -1. And it would also fall outside of these lines, it would become horizontal on these two. But because it is in the middle, and it never leaves the middle, and it doesn't even go to the left or right, you know that it's in mono. So with that being said, I'm going to use this one, and you'll be able to understand what you see now that I have explained it. So I have a mini synth with a preset I made called Tropical. It has the chorus effect, but it does not disappear in mono. Alongside that mini synth, I have an instance of R2, which I also discussed in a previous video in the isotope reviews. So if you want to understand what you're seeing here, then you can look at that, because I went over the entire thing when I was talking about the community bundle, and it was pretty cool because these things really are good. So I have this mini synth passing through this example of R2, and that's the reverb that is being provided. So now I'm going to show you this sound as it is with reverb, and then you can see the difference in correlation with reverb and with the reverb just by itself. So keep in mind that if you see these blue lines become horizontal, then that means that the signal is uncorrelated and that it would disappear in mono if I was to render it, and it would be summed to mono. So I'm gonna stop talking now and play a sound. So as I said, you can see that when I play the synth, there's a lot of information that's on the sides. So if you sum this to mono, that information is going to disappear. Now if I made the reverb wider and I play it again, there's a bit more that disappears in mono. You know, and that's without even testing it. You would just know that it's going to disappear because the vector scope is going to tell you. But if you were to switch it to mono, which I'll do as well, then you would hear the difference and you would see how much of the signal actually does disappear. So now, it's sort of misleading to just look at this without isolating the reverb. So I'm going to turn the sound of the synth off, but still play a note, and I have it set up so that it will play the reverb in isolation. So watch this. There's still going to be some mono information, and then you're going to see what I mean about the 3 colonies of ants, because you've got left and right, and those are going to cancel out. But you're going to see when I play this that there's some reverb still in the middle. So you will hear it regardless. And you can see that the channel that has the mini synth is turned off. So you're just hearing the reverb right now. but it doesn't totally disappear. Well, the last thing to look at here is you have stereo widening. So if you look on the top left, then you will notice that you have a stereo separation directly underneath where it says file. You have on the mixer tracks these knobs that can sum an individual mix element to mono or even the full mix itself. If I sum the reverb to mono, then it will be fully correlated. But I'm going to turn it the other way. And so it is 100% like separated as much as FL Studio can separate it. So when I press this, you're going to see how much more of it disappears. And then I'm going to turn the synth back on. So here is just the reverb in isolation. You can see how it stays near -1 the whole time. It's totally uncorrelated, and if I play it in mono, the majority of it will disappear. So here's not in mono. Here's mono. So from hearing that, you can see the difference when you sum something to mono and it's extremely wide and it's uncorrelated, how much of it will actually disappear. But now I'm going to turn the signal back to mono, and I'm going to slowly make this reverb to be correlated and switch it from stereo widening to full mono, and then you're going to see the amount that is going to remain. So here goes. It's in mono, and press some notes. Now you can see all the reverb is in the center, and it may not sound as wide as the other one, but it won't disappear in mono. You'll still be able to hear it. You may have this issue where if you use a ton of stereo widening plugins, or you do mid-side processing irresponsibly, which I'll talk about in another video, your side channels are going to be too loud, and when you sum it to mono, there's going to be phase cancellation because they're uncorrelated, and a significant amount of your music is going to disappear. And that's the reason why it's still important to consider mono while you're mixing, because even though the majority of listeners are going to have more upgraded devices, there are places like clubs where it has never switched from being mono because the size of the stereo system necessitates it, being that it would be just too expensive to replace. And possibly if you think about somewhere like a nightclub that has a mono stereo system, which really sounds ironic to say, but it has like giant mono speakers, right? If they host every night, then they would lose clientele if they had to remove their sound system and it did not just simply break, you know, they would be giving out money. And so for that reason, you want to consider things like that, especially if you make dance music, because you don't want your entire mix to disappear while people are trying to dance to it. So I am going to switch this one more time so you can hear it as it goes from stereo to mono. And then I'll do the same thing with the original sound added back in. And then that'll be all. So here goes. And you can see, even with just the reverb, that on the graph, it switched from showing that the sound is going to disappear to all of it being stable in the middle. So that shows you none of it will disappear in mono. It will all remain. Now here's the same thing, the same type of transformation. I'll actually move this down with the original signal from the synthesizer added back to the reverb. So you'll notice that in the beginning, it would show that a lot of the information was going to disappear. But as I correlated the reverb, it's showing again that none of it is going to disappear. So the takeaway from observing that is that you can choose not to make the reverb fully mono, because it might also sound weird if there are sounds panned in, but the reverb is in the middle instead of being where they are. And you could make it simply a little bit more correlated. Like say, look to the top left where it says 100% merged. Let's say if I did like maybe 50% merged and I played it, maybe the reverb would not fully disappear and I could get the effect that I'm looking for without having to have all the reverb in the center, because that is also the type of thing that could create mud in the lower mid frequency range. And with that being said, I hope you have an awesome day. I thank you for watching as usual, and I have not decided what the next video is going to be about. Mid-side processing would be a worthy topic, and it would make sense because that also goes along with mono. And of course, it's something that I will have to talk about at some point, but I'm not sure if it will be the next video. But you will see when the next video comes out. Because mono is extremely complicated to explain, and I was having trouble figuring out how I was going to say it in a way that I felt others would actually understand. Because I don't want to confuse you just because I already get it. You know? So, truly, if you do understand, then I am excited about that. But if you don't, please comment and explain what your confusion is. And if you're listening to even this breakdown, then I thank you once again for watching the entire video and sticking all the way to the end. Your viewership is totally appreciated. And with that, I'm signing off. Have an awesome day. Peace.